The last guns of World War II fell silent in the autumn of 1945, yet the world did not feel at peace. Cities smoldered under a grey sky, borders shifted overnight, and millions of soldiers went home carrying secrets that would soon shape a new kind of war, a war without front lines. In Washington, General William Wild Bill Donovan, founder of the Wartime Office of Strategic Services, walked the marble corridors of the old War Department for what he knew might be the final time. His OSS had gathered intelligence behind enemy lines, smuggled resistance fighters into Europe, and decoded the whispers of empires. But the president had ordered the OSS dismantled. America, tired of war, wanted its spies to vanish as quickly as its soldiers. Yet Donovan understood something others did not: victory had opened a door into an age of information. Bombs could flatten cities, but information could control nations. He warned, we must never again be blind to the intentions of others. Few listened. Behind the Potomac's calm surface, new rivals watched each other. In Moscow, Joseph Stalin was already sealing the borders of Eastern Europe behind an iron curtain. Soviet agents flooded Berlin and Vienna, hunting German scientists and the blueprints of a weapon more terrifying than any bomb. American officers noticed. The peace that followed 1945 was already cracking. From that urgency came a temporary creation, the Central Intelligence Group, a small coordination body meant only to gather fragments of wartime intelligence. But within 2 years, that seed would grow roots deeper than anyone imagined. In 1947, President Harry Truman signed the National Security Act, merging military, diplomatic, and intelligence arms under a new order. Out of the paper's black ink rose an agency that had no army, no flag, and no fixed battlefield: the Central Intelligence Agency. Its headquarters were not yet the Grand Complex at Langley. In those early years, CIA officers worked from scattered offices across Washington, D.C., anonymous doors, unmarked desks, and telephones that could not reveal their numbers. They were veterans, linguists, mathematicians, idealists, and cynics, united by one belief: the next war would be fought in silence. The first director, Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter, understood that secrecy would define them. The agency's budget was buried inside other departments. Its failures, if exposed, could collapse governments. Its successes would be written nowhere. We will be judged only by history, he told his staff, and history will never know our names. Meanwhile, the Cold War took its first breaths. In 1948, Europe trembled under shortages and Soviet pressure. To prevent communist parties from taking power through hunger and fear, the CIA launched Operation Mockingbird's earliest precursors: quiet support for newspapers and broadcasters sympathetic to democratic ideals. Money changed hands in back rooms, printing presses turned, and stories flowed that shaped the minds of millions. Without firing a bullet, America learned the power of narrative. But the agency's reach soon moved beyond persuasion. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb. The flash above the Kazakh steppe told Washington that America's monopoly on fear was over. President Truman needed eyes behind the curtain. So the CIA built them: high-altitude cameras, hidden microphones, double agents who risked everything for a photograph of a missile or a line of code. By the early 1950s, Allen Dulles, a man of charm, secrecy, and ruthless conviction, took the helm. Under his direction, the agency ceased to be merely an observer; it became an instrument. The Cold War was not just a contest of armies, it was a struggle for alignment, for ideology, for influence over leaders whose choices would tilt continents. And Dulles believed America had to act first. In 1953, Iran's elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, sought to nationalize British oil holdings. London turned to Washington, and soon quiet discussions in Georgetown cafes turned into Operation Ajax, a plan to shape history with bribes, leaflets, and protests disguised as revolutions. The Shah returned to power, grateful and indebted. The world never saw the invisible hand that guided the chaos. A year later, in Guatemala, a similar pattern unfolded. The CIA labeled it Operation PBSES, designed to topple President Jacobo Arbenz, whose land reforms threatened a U.S. corporation's holdings. Propaganda broadcasts, psychological pressure, and a small invasion convinced the world that a great rebellion had begun. When Arbenz fled, Washington called it a victory for freedom. Others called it the beginning of empire. Inside the agency, morale soared, covert action seemed unstoppable. In secret corridors, maps were dotted with pins: Tehran, Guatemala City, Berlin, Seoul. Dulles smiled. America, he believed, had discovered a new kind of power, control without conquest. But every victory carried shadows. Each operation built habits of intervention, of shaping nations unseen. And soon the agency faced an opponent it could not so easily move, the Soviet KGB, equal parts mirror and nemesis. Spies hunted spies. In Berlin, tunnels snaked beneath streets. One of them, the Berlin Tunnel, tapped Soviet communications for months before discovery. The world never knew how close it came to open conflict. At home, Americans only saw fragments. Newspapers spoke of freedom, progress, and peace. Few realized that a quiet bureaucracy, invisible to Congress and unknown to most citizens, was writing the hidden diary of the Cold War. Through the 1950s, satellites replaced pigeons, computers replaced filing cabinets, and language itself became a weapon. Radio Free Europe and Voice of America broadcast across the Iron Curtain, telling stories of democracy and prosperity. To millions behind the wall, those voices sounded like hope. To the Kremlin, they were noise from an empire of lies. Yet inside the CIA, not everyone shared Dulles' confidence. Young analysts began to ask uneasy questions: had we traded morality for strategy? Was the defense of freedom becoming its opposite? Files were marked, eyes only. Doubt became another secret. By 1957, the space above Earth filled with the beeping signal of Sputnik 1. The Soviet satellite crossed the American sky every 96 minutes, and each pass whispered a warning: technology could outpace ideology. The CIA responded with Project Corona, the first spy satellites, disguised as scientific missions, returning film canisters that fell from orbit and parachuted into the Pacific. The empire of secrecy had left the planet. At the decade's end, one event exposed the fragile line between secrecy and scandal. In 1960, a U-2 reconnaissance plane piloted by Francis Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union. Washington first claimed it was a weather flight. Moscow revealed the captured pilot and photographs of Soviet bases. The deception collapsed, and for the first time the CIA's invisible work stood naked before the world. Allies grew cautious, enemies emboldened. Even President Eisenhower, a general who had once trusted secrecy, saw its cost. But history rarely moves backward. The Cold War was now self-sustaining. New nations emerged from colonial rule, each became a potential ally or adversary. The CIA, guided by Dulles and later successors, expanded operations across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Covert funding, propaganda, and political maneuvering became instruments of foreign policy. What had begun as a guardian of information was becoming an architect of influence. Inside Langley's newly built headquarters, a vast modern fortress of glass and steel completed in 1961, rows of analysts studied satellite images, code intercepts, and reports from agents whose names they would never know. The world map before them was not geography, it was strategy. Each pin meant leverage, each file meant potential. The agency that started in borrowed offices had become the silent nervous system of American power. 1961, the chill of the Cold War hung heavier than ever. A new president walked into the White House, John F. Kennedy, young, brilliant, and determined to prove that the American century had only begun. But behind his charm and optimism, the CIA was already preparing a storm that would test both the agency and the nation's soul. Cuba, only 90 miles from Florida, had fallen under Fidel Castro's revolution. His defiance of American interests, and his alliance with Moscow, turned the Caribbean into a front line. The CIA had a plan, one approved before Kennedy's election: a covert invasion of Cuban exiles trained and armed to overthrow Castro's regime. It was called the Bay of Pigs. In April 1961, those men landed on a lonely beach. Within 3 days, they were surrounded, captured, and humiliated. The mission collapsed before the world's cameras. The new president felt betrayed by the intelligence he was given. "They told me success was guaranteed," he muttered bitterly. Inside Langley, silence fell. The aura of infallibility cracked. Dulles, the architect of covert power, was dismissed. The empire of shadows had met daylight. But the agency did not disappear. It evolved. Under new leadership, the CIA turned its focus to the greater jewel of the era, the Soviet Union. Espionage entered its golden age. Double agents like Oleg Penkovsky in Moscow passed secrets that kept the world from nuclear war. Tiny cameras hidden in pens, coded messages inside newspapers, invisible ink, and microdots became the tools of a global chess match. Each move, each betrayal, could tilt the balance of the Cold War. In October 1962, U.S. reconnaissance photographs revealed Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. For 13 days, the world stood on the edge of annihilation. The CIA's U-2 flights and satellite images gave Kennedy the proof he needed, and, ultimately, the confidence to stand firm. Quietly, intelligence prevented war. For a brief moment, the agency redeemed itself. Yet shadows always return. As the 1960s deepened, a different war drew America's attention: Vietnam. Officially, the CIA's role was limited to information and analysis. In reality, it was far more. The agency trained local militias, orchestrated psychological operations, and tracked the elusive Viet Cong through jungles and villages. The line between intelligence and warfare vanished in the mud of Southeast Asia. From these operations grew the Phoenix program, an effort to identify and dismantle enemy networks. Though its goal was to weaken insurgents, its methods blurred into moral gray. Interrogations, informants, covert strikes, all in the name of containment. As reports leaked, critics saw not protection but overreach. The image of America's secret defenders began to darken. At home, cultural winds shifted. The post-war optimism of the 1950s gave way to rebellion, protest, and doubt. Americans questioned authority, and with it, the unseen hands that guided foreign policy. The CIA, once wrapped in mystique, now stood accused of manipulation and deceit. In 1967, journalist reports revealed the agency's hidden funding of student organizations, writers, and magazines, all part of its cultural strategy to counter Soviet influence. The revelations shocked citizens who had believed in transparency. The Cold War, it seemed, was not only fought overseas but in the American mind. Then came 1973, the Watergate scandal. Though the CIA was not its architect, the very idea of secret operations feeding political power made the public suspicious of every agency acronym. When the investigations widened, names, files, and dates surfaced that painted a picture far more complex than anyone imagined. 2 years later, the Church Committee hearings began. Senators sat before the cameras, demanding answers about decades of covert actions, domestic surveillance, and foreign interventions. For the first time, the agency that had lived in silence was forced to speak. The hearings exposed details of assassination plots, propaganda networks, and experiments that pushed ethical limits. The CIA's reputation, once gilded by patriotism, was now tempered by distrust. Yet even in crisis, reform brought rebirth. In 1976, President Gerald Ford established permanent oversight committees, a recognition that power in the dark must answer to light. The agency, bruised but unbroken, adapted again. Technology was reshaping intelligence. Satellites now photographed entire continents, computers processed signals that once took armies to decode. Through the 1980s, under President Ronald Reagan, the CIA found a new mission, confronting the Soviet Union in its final act. From Afghanistan's mountains to the jungles of Central America, the agency supported resistance movements that bled Moscow's resources and influence. Some called it the Empire's revenge, others, the final chapter of the long twilight struggle. In 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Crowds cheered, hammers struck stone, and for the first time in half a century, the Iron Curtain cracked open. Inside Langley, veterans who had spent their entire lives fighting a hidden war watched their enemy collapse without a shot fired. Files were closed. Operations ended. The world had changed. But peace brought its own confusion. Without the Soviet threat, what was the purpose of America's secret empire? The 1990s answered with new dangers: rogue states, terrorism, and digital espionage. The agency redefined itself yet again, trading Cold War tactics for global surveillance and counterterrorism. Satellites became eyes, algorithms became analysts. And still, in the heart of every operation, the same question echoed, the one Donovan had asked at the very beginning: how far can a free nation go to defend its freedom? By the dawn of the 21st century, that question would resurface in ways unimaginable. The attacks of September 11, 2001, would shake the world, and the CIA, born in the ashes of one war, would find itself at the center of another. But that is another story, one written in the smoke of new wars, new technologies, and new controversies. Epilogue, the legacy of the shadow today. The Central Intelligence Agency remains both a symbol and a mystery. To some, it represents vigilance, a shield against threats that most will never see. To others, it stands as a warning, proof that secrecy, once unleashed, can become a force unto itself. From the dim offices of 1947 to the digital labyrinths of the modern age, the agency's story mirrors America's own, born from fear, driven by ambition, shaped by ideals, and haunted by compromise. Every satellite image, every whispered report, every covert meeting in a foreign cafe carries the same paradox, that freedom must sometimes operate in darkness to survive in light. And so the curtain closes, but the watchers remain. In the quiet rooms of Langley, where clocks have no windows and phones have no names, a simple creed endures: in secrecy we serve, so that others may never need to know.